Thanks for joining on this New York City conversation we're having.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we had talked, at some point, maybe when we get back being face-to-face, we'll do a longer Behind the Bricks episode. But
yeah, that's great.
Just to timestamp this, as we're recording this feels like we're starting kind of phase 2 of quarantine. It's just about a month since the whole city has been shut down. And, with last week them announcing we hit the peak, and now we're kind of like either at the top of the curve or coming down on the backside of it. How has it been for you? How have you been coping personally?
Yeah, I think personally, I've been lucky to be one, healthy and safe and able to work from home, and two, to not have children at home, and so able to work from home and focus and get my work done.
Mm-hmm.
So personally, it's been okay. I've been lucky in that way.
What have been do you remember the, kind of the day or the moment where you realized that this was going to be an event that was going to massively change, the organization and really how you guys do business?
Very well. I think it was a similar week for everyone. It was that week of March, 12th, 13th, 14th, I think,
Mm-hmm.
were the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or the few days before that.
Right.
When companies were starting, you would see the map that they were putting in the news of all the cases in Midtown, and companies were starting to move their operations to work from home. And we
Right.
had started talking about and preparing and making sure that everyone had internet access and server access and remote access and had their Skype running so that they could do remote calls and things like that. But I think it was that Thursday that it became very clear that it was happening right now. And
Right.
so we realized that while we were preparing as best we could, there were some things we really hadn't accounted for.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that Thursday was a full day of taking stock of all of the in-person operations that we hadn't necessarily thought of and needed people, either a skeleton crew coming into the office some days, or needed to get people the right equipment and access so that they could be doing those things from home. That was Thursday, the 12th or whatever that Thursday was before.
Right.
It really happened.
Yeah. So as of today, A&E manages, you guys own and operate about approximately how many units across in one, you can't believe everything you read on the internet, but in one statistic, I think you guys are like the 5th largest owner of multifamily in the city or something like that. How many units is it about?
10 to 15,000.
Right. So to give, just for anyone who's listening to this, they have a sense of the scale of how many homes really you guys needed to mobilize to adjust to. So what were some of the biggest tactical on the ground changes that you guys had to make?
Yeah, so I think that you make a good point. We own and manage 10 to 15,000 homes. And those people who live in those homes were our first priority, making sure that we were going to be able to continue to communicate with them, and to provide the service that we need to be providing for them. And so I guess one of the first things was our front desk staff and answering the phones and resident requests and calls that come in. And so we realized that we had 1 or 2 front desk staff, but that the number of calls that would come in, because we have a lot of residents who come in person, was going to increase quite a bit. So some of the people whose work from home or whose functions were not going to be as heavy because they were working from home, we moved them to help the front desk staff and to answer calls as they were coming in, because we knew that was going to be a lot. We were also, obviously we needed to make sure that we had enough cleaning supplies on hand. to clean the buildings with CDC approved materials, and that those materials were probably going to see a shortage.
Right.
So we were calling all of our vendors who supply those materials, and getting as much of that as possible without hoarding, because we wanted to be sensitive to that issue as well.
Yeah.
But making sure that we were aware of the suppliers who had the best access, and keeping a good relationship with them, and getting as much of those supplies on hand, and taking stock of what was at each building and what was at each neighboring building, so that we could share materials and use them as efficiently as possible. And then we have a lot of residents who may not have email addresses, or we didn't have email addresses on file. They've been in the building for many, many years, long before email was a thing.
Yeah.
And so we do a lot of paper notices slipped under doors, and realized that that was going to be something that was going to be harder and harder to do because of the manpower required to do that.
Yeah.
And
So the actually just delivering, rent payment slips and all this kind of stuff was probably a massive change for many of your residents.
Yeah, well, our rent payment slips are a little more of an automated process, but any other communication around, especially around, and in a time like this, people want a lot of communication. What are we doing if there is a suspected case or a confirmed case, and how are we keeping the building sanitized, and all of that, and what are our policies? Are we closing the gym? Are we not? At that time, everything was changing by the hour. And so we had almost every employee calling residents to try to get email addresses, so that we could stay in contact with them. We also, New York City multifamily is an old school business in a lot of ways, and a paper business in a lot of ways. And we still have a lot of people who mail in rent checks. And so without the right people going to the office to collect the mail, we realized we would be struggling to process those checks.
Right.
So we went through a few iterations of a revised mail policy, but our most current iteration is that we have some employees who would normally be helping out with construction, and construction is halted, going to the office to pick up the mail, take it to the correct person to sort, and then to process, someone in accounting, and so that we can process those rent checks. So it's surprising, some of the operations that have been difficult to move to work from home, or have required a lot of thought as to how to keep it secure and keep it running in a timely manner, while everybody is trying to stay home.
Right. And what conversations did you have with your supers? I mean, I'm getting these type of questions that, other owners are having to give very granular advice to, their building staff and people who do construction, and, something like a super.
Yeah, so we have obviously supers who run the gamut, who have been there forever, who are much more green. And we also share supers across buildings to the extent we have some really experienced supers next to some less experienced supers. Our property managers have been in constant communication with those supers around proper cleaning of the buildings, letting us know if there are any suspected or confirmed cases, but also around, everybody's home. So we're getting a lot of routine maintenance requests. Paint is peeling, or small things that when you're home they bother you more because you're there all the time.
Right.
We, for the most part, unless it's an emergency in terms of will affect the building or the unit over the long term, we're not doing as much of that to keep both the resident and the building employees safe, but communicating that policy and managing those issues as they were coming up and before we had that policy in place was definitely communication with the supers. But we're also, throughout the company, we're having more and more communication with the supers to thank them, and to acknowledge the fact that they are our frontline and on the ground staff and our essential staff, and to tell them how much we appreciate the work that they're doing, and that they continue to be there every day.
Well, that's a very interesting thing that I'm finding with this whole event, is that it's highlighting a lot of the areas in society and business that people take for granted. You know, and you said New York City real estate is kind of an old school business, which it is, and it's still by paper, but you know, it's like you're highlighting the super as so important in vital in people's everyday lives. And also, you know, just you know, especially the multifamily business in New York is such a punching bag. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of people who are, you know, people who would be listening to this, who are essentially operating and running housing for New York City, either themselves or their employees are putting themselves on the front line in exposure of this disease, or just basically, you know, all the things that they need to do to provide service. And I think, you know, it's symbolic in a way. We got some good news about a week and a half ago with the Court of Appeals Regina case about the you know, the 4-year look back for tenant files and stuff like that. And I, you know, to have that happen while this is occurring, and everyone, like you said, now more than ever, people are actually spending, you know, 24 hours a day inside their apartment. They're realizing how important their service is, and maybe seeing, you know, firsthand how much work goes into operating and you know, just running these buildings, not to mention the fact that many of them are 100 years old and need constant upkeep. So you know, that's a topic that I wonder, because you can take a major event, this is really kind of like a wartime event, and say, does this push the politics, you know, more toward government intervention or less? And you know, hopefully, as far as it relates to owners, there's more appreciation for the services that they do, and so you get a little more flexibility there. When you and I were talking about this about a week and a half ago, I find that times like these are also very interesting for entrepreneurial organizations, because you come up with these creative solutions, some of what you just talked about how now we're having this employee do this that they weren't doing, and we, you know, we're communicating with our tenants this way, and now we didn't have, you know, we're getting email for all. From your standpoint today, is there anything that you think that you're coming up with because of your response to the virus that you think may be a benefit that you will still use after the virus, besides having Zoom conversations with me?
Nothing's coming to mind immediately, except, you know, the obvious that I think a lot of companies would I mean, I think we've been very surprised at how effective and immediately effective, and how good at working from home all of our staff has been, and how quickly we've been able to respond to things that come up, and sort of act as if we're in the office and host meetings quickly and add people so that we're all in the same place. Right. Which I think a lot of companies are realizing that they can work remotely a lot more efficiently than they realize. Some probably already knew that, but we didn't. We didn't have a work from home policy. But that's probably the only thing that's really coming to mind.
Well, it's also, when you go through times like this, you strip away everything that's non-essential, and then it highlights all the extremely essential things that you're doing. You know,
yeah,
we've definitely found that. Thinking about, I've noticed kind of this mindset shift also this week, that, you know, now you've hit the peak. Whereas the last couple of weeks, everybody was asking the question, well, how bad is it going to get? And the focus was really about the trajectory of the virus. And now that we're at the peak, everyone's kind of asking, well, what's next? What does this look like? What does the reopening look like? What is, you know, you're starting to think either 30 days out or 60, 90, you know, maybe several months out. And the opinions I've had from other owners have been all over the map. what do and obviously this month, and really I think May, more importantly, everyone wants to know about collections and stuff like this, but what do you think some of the more longer term impacts are, as a result of this event? I mean, we talked about more people moving home, but do you think it impacts New York City in any type of, occupancy way? What's your thought?
I mean, I guess
This is a hard question. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
That's okay. Nobody has a crystal ball, and I don't want to pretend to know what will happen, but I think we believe in the long-term stability of New York City, over time.
Yeah.
People want to be here. People have always wanted to be here. I think New York City multifamily in particular, people need a place to live. I know there's a lot of talk about sort of the move towards urbanization recently, and possibly some of that slowing or reversing because of the density and exposure to other people. But I think there have been moments in time in the past where there have been similar conversations about the long-term viability of New York, and it's held.
Yeah.
And I think that at the end of the day, it's a vibrant city. There's a lot going on here. There are a lot of companies that want to be here, a lot of people that want to be here. And I think that if we're talking long-term, that's not going to change. That's not going anywhere.
Yeah, and maybe this will help kind of sharpen up the question, because I agree with you. I think long term, I've had some people say, people, number one, are not going to restaurants. They're staying home and they're enjoying cooking. So, and maybe that is partly true, but I still think 2 years from now,
they're also stir crazy.
Yeah, people will be going to restaurants just like they were. But what we were predicting just from the data is that this summer, rents were poised to rise in New York for various supply things, just the supply dynamics. And if you think about the implications of the virus and what it is doing to current development and, any home buying that was taking away from renters, the virus actually is pushing more people to rent right now. Because you're going to have less supply, you're going to have less home buying, depending on the impacts of the economy and, whatever type of recession this ends up causing. So, so it's just an interesting time, because New York, kind of has the name of the epicenter of the virus, but that's where all the solutions are coming from as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the more interesting trends that we've also seen during all of this, I expected leasing to grind to a halt, effectively, and it's slowed for sure.
Right.
But we're finding that the people who are looking for apartments are much more serious, because you're not casually looking right now.
Yeah.
And so people still have to move their leases up, or their family situation is changing, and they still have to move. And if they don't have to move, they're pushing it off. But I think there's only so long you can push that off, right? And so there will be some pent up activity that'll come up in the next few months. But we are finding that people are still leasing apartments and looking at apartments and doing virtual tours, and we're allowing them to tour the unit to the extent we can do it no contact. The super goes and unlocks for 20
and then
minutes.
they come in.
Yeah. And so, I think I agree with what you said.
Yeah, that's been another prediction that we've had that I'm trying to get a handle on, is that the virus is actually preventing some moves that were planned, that maybe in the absence of virus, some people would have moved that they're not right now because they're deciding. So it's probably early. We probably need another 30 or 60 days, but have you got any sense of your renewal rate that's higher or lower than it normally is?
So far, I mean, we've been tracking that. It hasn't been long enough to get a real sense, because it's only been one first of the month. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, even though it's out in the future, it's still one first of the month. It's generally on trend. so far. We have had a few, month-to-month requests, people who I think hope to move but are kind of trying to delay it a little bit more, things like that. So I think it'll tick up a little bit, but if you're having a kid or a kid's moving out or your family is moving, you have reasons you have to move anyway. And so I think that will continue to happen. Sorry, my dog's going a little bit nuts.
Hey, that's all right. Add some flavor. If you want to, you can take a video. You can add them to the screen. Well, look, we had talked about this being, just a quick little spotlight on how operations are changing. I'm getting a lot of these questions from owners of just, how they're adapting to a new environment. Any last piece of advice you would have? There are a lot of owners who maybe, are operating, they're basically owner operators. Any advice in terms of how to deal with this crisis or that's kind of come to mind overarching that you've gone back to?
I think that internally our philosophy and our advice to our staff and is just to sort of stay positive, keep moving along. This too shall pass is something that we've been saying a lot across our internal Zoom calls. And we will be back in business, and it's definitely, not to minimize, it's going to be rough, and it's going to be rough for some sectors more than others and some people more than others, but rough for everybody across the board, and but it will end.
Yeah, that's a great phrase to be saying during these times. So Maggie, thanks very much for joining us, and
thanks for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you soon.